How's it going, ladies and gents out there? So James Gunn went on the Michael Rosenbaum podcast. Great podcast, by the way. Very down to earth. I listen to it all the time, so do check it out. But I thought it would be interesting if I would do a video covering all of what he said about the upcoming DCU, from him talking about stepping into the role of co-head of DC Studios, describing the ambition of the DCU, the differences between the MCU and the DCU, how the DCU will even differentiate itself from recycled spectacle films, tones of DCU movies, Superman, the pressure of Superman, the casting of Superman, and he had some interesting and funny things to say about all the casting or test screening reports out there. The idea of superhero fatigue in today's comic book audiences. Also some assurances about Blue Beetle being in the DCU, of course Peacemaker Season 2, a new aesthetic for Superman, mentions of Star City, Bludhaven, and honestly, much more. So if you couldn't tell already, this is going to be a deep dive video. I'm really excited to talk about everything in it. Video chapters, of course, will be available to you, like timestamps if you want to skip around various chapters in the video. But if you're a fan of learning about the future of the DCU, I do recommend staying for the whole video, because the talk of the future gets quite introspective and detailed from Gunn's answers and descriptions and the approach to what's coming our way. So first of all, let's tackle the more snappy news tidbits that were mentioned. I will get into the more, what I would say, fascinating conversation about his plans moving forward with the DCU and James Gunn's perspective after this little news roundup, if you will. So first up, Michael Rosenbaum asks, is Peacemaker really coming back, or is there just no time for it? And he says, no, Peacemaker is coming back right after Superman. That's my next thing. Going straight from Superman to Peacemaker, but Waller's first, and Waller is a lot of the same people from Peacemaker. So Peacemaker did get announced for a season 2, but this was when, and well, actually before James Gunn came into head or co-head of DC Studios October 25th, I think it was. So obviously things did change a little bit because he was running a studio, he's got Superman Legacy, he's writing and directing, so things did change a little bit in terms of it being put on the back burner a little bit rather than, you know, being tackled first, but it is still coming. But we will be seeing Peacemaker characters in the Waller show. I mean, if you've watched Peacemaker, you'll see that Waller was present in that around the beginning and the end, especially the ending. You've got Amanda Waller's daughter in the show as well, so I do think the repercussions from the Peacemaker show, what happened at the end with Waller, will bring in Amanda Waller's daughter again, and obviously some other Peacemaker characters. And hey, I'm looking forward to that. I loved Peacemaker, so whenever that comes, I'll be very excited for it. But also, I might get a fix in the Waller show. And then Michael Rosenbaum asks about Suicide Squad 2, and James Gunn gave a very brief, short answer. He said, is there a... And then he said, no. Like, it was just as simple as that. Is there a... So he was like, he was going to continue saying Suicide Squad 2, but before he even finished that, he said no, and then they quickly moved on to the next thing. I'm not so sure if this is like a deep thing, but it is something that was interesting to learn, because obviously he directed the Suicide Squad. It released during the pandemic. It didn't do as great as maybe it could have done if it released today, but still, considering he's the head of DC Studios, people were thinking, okay, well, will there be another one? Because he can get another group together, or possibly some of the characters from the first movie. First one that comes to mind is Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn, and do another one. But it seems like, at least for now, that's a one and done. Plus, we've literally got the roadmap for DCU Chapter 1. That leads at least all the way up to 2027 with Swamp Thing, at least from what I've been saying. And if you judge the releases, how much they said they're going to release a year in terms of movie format, TV show format, and Suicide Squad, you know, wasn't on that list. This doesn't mean that the roadmap can't change and be shuffled around a bit, but for the most part, yes, Suicide Squad won't be coming back for now, or like indefinitely, but who knows in the next 10 years. James Gunn also talks about Creature Commando, saying, I've got a new soundtrack for Creature Commandos, that's actually the first DCU project. That's the animated show we're doing, and that comes out in a year or so, but we're recording it all now. So I'm just glad stuff like this is being said out there, because I've said, like, Creature Commandos, Waller, Blue Beetle and whatnot are DCU canon, but people still say to me, no, the DCU starts with the Superman Legacy movie, and that's just not true. Superman Legacy is the first movie being made during the DCU's new reign, but it's not the first DCU project in the canon of the DCU to release. That is actually, well, technically Blue Beetle, and then Aquaman 2, and then Creature Commandos, which is animation. But as we know, and as what we're going to get into with more answers in today's video, it goes across animation, video games, TV shows, movies. A very cohesive DCU across all kinds of media. And then Michael Rosenbaum asked something which gets us clarification about Blue Beetle, even though, again, I feel like this clarification's already been out there. James Gunn has said before he can totally be in the DCU, but just to like set it in stone, James Gunn responds here: the MCU and now the DCU in film, which doesn't really start, I mean, the first DCU character for sure is Blue Beetle, and the first full DCU movie is Superman. And again, what he means by the latter there, the first full DCU movie being Superman, is just like, well, the first full one that we've made during our DCU era is Superman, but because Blue Beetle, granted that it was made during the old regime, it did or even made effort to make a larger connection to the old DCEU. It's an origin story, so it actually was very lucky in terms of how, considering how self-contained it was, after the Flash reset, if you will, and now we're moving into the DCU, Blue Beetle can and will be canonical to the DCU. Now, that doesn't guarantee it will get a sequel movie. Of course, that depends on numbers, but even if it doesn't get a sequel, if the box office isn't as pleasing as they want it to be, that doesn't mean that the character, like Sheldon Duane's Blue Beetle, that doesn't mean that he's not canon. For example, might not get a sequel, but could pop up in Booster Gold or somewhere else. But yes, Blue Beetle is technically the first DCU canon project, but not the first DCU made project, because, you know, there's a difference between when it was made and when Superman Legacy is being made under the DCU days that we're now going into. Now, with regards to a little bit of Superman here, Michael Rosenbaum asks if it's true there'll be a KRYPTO the Dog in Superman Legacy. Gunn explains when talking about this isn't so much of a direct quote, but I just kind of summarized it, that in an interview with Chris Pratt, which is where this first came from, and all these outlets were posting it on social media accounts, that KRYPTO is going to be in Superman Legacy. James Gunn said in that interview with Chris Pratt, he said that he could play KRYPTO. And then Chris goes, oh, now we're saying KRYPTO's in the movie. That's a scoop. So like James Gunn was explaining to Rosenbaum like the origin of how that got out there. He didn't confirm that's a joke, but with the explanation, it describes it as more of a jokey situation. So I think this somewhat spells that KRYPTO the Dog, in terms of superhero KRYPTO the Dog, might not be in Superman Legacy. It doesn't technically deny it, because all he's doing is explaining the situation of how this news came to be, which, granted, was a jokey somewhat thing between James Gunn in that interview and Chris Pratt. But I don't think it completely rules it out, because despite reading between the lines here and it seeming like it all is a joke, and it doesn't seem like it will be if it was a joke situation, you could still have a dog in the movie, Kal-El's dog, named KRYPTO. Do you know what I mean? So take that as you will. Carrying on the Superman talk here, when talking about the aesthetics of movies with the cinematographer, the VFX supervisor, costume, James Gunn then mentions there's a look, there's an aesthetic that you want to put against everything, especially with movies and how we're doing Superman. We're creating an aesthetic that hasn't existed before. So that is super interesting. And I don't want to read into this too much, because like, we don't really know what he means by how with the Superman Legacy movie, you know, they're creating an aesthetic that hasn't existed before. Because he's talking about it's important to have communication across hair, makeup, the VFX. Everyone needs to be present in all of these meetings and kept in the loop, because otherwise you might end up with movies where clearly the costume designer or whomever else wasn't, you know, on the same page as the set designer. So it's so important to get that right. And then he kind of went on to elaborate that with Superman Legacy, they're actually creating a whole new aesthetic that hasn't existed before. So obviously that means visually with the movie. And this is quite exciting. I mean, again, I don't want to overhype it, because I don't know where to pin the tail on the donkey, so to speak, with what he exactly means there. But the fact that they're striving to achieve a look that hasn't necessarily existed before, I mean, his words there, is an intriguing thing to hear. Could it be like Metropolis in the way the camera pans and just the larger breath of life in this universe just has such almost comic book 2-page look of the golden city of Metropolis and the way, it looks. You know how like distinguished the Burton Batman Gotham was? Just stuff like that. I mean, obviously that's an aesthetic that has existed, but maybe not necessarily in modern comic book media like through and through. Sure, you get comic book accurate cities. I mean, look at Matt Reeves' Gotham, but imagine that applied all over the board. But yeah, I don't know what specifically he means, so would love to know your thoughts down in the comments below here. Up next, let's dive into some of the deeper questions and more detailed answers from Gunn about the DCU, Superman, everything I mentioned earlier. This is where it gets pretty interesting and, invites a lot of conversation. So when initially talking about the DCU with Michael Rosenbaum, James Gunn describes his experience going into it as an opportunity to do something that has never existed before, to create the biggest story ever told across film, television, gaming, and more, to really create a cohesive DC universe. And I know that sounds like we've kind of heard this before, but again, in this podcast, they go through somewhat these different layers. So he went on to say, I also knew that there was going to be many challenges as we embarked on that journey, because people have different ideas about how things are supposed to be. People have all sorts of things that they love, whether they love things from the DCEU or they love things from the animated worlds or whatever. That is something that we knew was going to be a ring of fire we were going to have to walk through, which is just true no matter what. And I think we've all witnessed it even right now. People aren't too happy, for sure. I understand a lot of it with regards to like Henry Cavill. It is being recast. The Snyderverse is being left behind. We're going into a new phase of the DCU, whether you like it or not. And it's going to rub people up the wrong way, even across DC TV shows. Like another somewhat area that not everyone gets involved in, but like the Arrowverse. We're now having TV shows similar to what the MCU does. We have, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, characters of whom have been in the movies, but are now in the TV shows. WandaVision, we're getting that treatment. So while shows like Superman and Lois could technically go on to season 5, because around that time it will be 2025 and we'll really be into the DCU, after that, that is kind of it. And ultimately, not everyone is going to be on the same page there. But to quote The Matrix, it's an inevitability. So James Gunn knew that. He knew he was going to be a bit of a ring of fire to walk through, as he said. But it is what it is, for better or for worse. And I like to choose the optimistic take there. And that's even when Michael Rosenbaum said, you knew you were going to be loved and hated at the same time. And he said, I knew there was going to be a period of hardship. I knew there had been spectacular missteps in the past with all sorts of different choices. Which is when we now move on to Michael Rosenbaum asking, when being asked to be the head of DC, he goes on to put himself into James Gunn's position. Was this going to hinder me from continuing my filmmaking and having all of that passion into one focus, as opposed to now worrying about running a studio? Like, does Peter help that out? And James Gunn says, Peter helps that out. I only have so much time in a day. I only have so much I can do. I think it was always a question about how much am I going to spend on writing? How much am I going to spend on directing? How much am I going to spend ushering other writers? How much am I going to spend ushering other directors? How much am I going to spend mapping out the sort of story that other writers can follow? I only have so much I can do. I am aware of that. And I love directing, so I didn't want to lose that either. But in my heart, I'm a storyteller. In my heart, I am not the same as other filmmakers, I don't think. Some other filmmakers for sure, but in my heart, I consider myself a storyteller. Which is fair enough, because it's a very relevant question for Rosenbaum to ask there, because when you're moving into this role, does that mean you're only going to be focused on one thing, of which you would think would kind of be the case with the responsibilities that he has? But I suppose the difference between Gunn and Feige is that he also has Peter Safran there to do a lot of other heavy lifting in other areas, and James Gunn really focusing on the creative guidance there, like mapping out the story, obviously letting other writers write those stories like Batman Brave and the Bold, but also ushering them, as he says himself, with what the main bullet points are to hit, as Kevin Feige would, right? So, that's an interesting thing. James Gunn knows how the overall story is going to go, But obviously, you're going to have, let's just say, Andy Muschietti is writing Batman Brave and the Bold, which it does seem to be the case. He can still write the script or, maybe hire somebody else, but they have to adhere to certain points. But I'm just like honing in on one thing there. He talked about all of these other things that he has to focus on, but he also didn't want to lose directing. So he is directing Peacemaker Season 2, as we know. He is directing Superman Legacy. And overall, like whether it's directing or not so much that, he's very happy in the role he's in because he's still like, at the head of DC on the creative side, and that is inherently a storyteller. Okay, so up next we have Rosenbaum asking, when being asked about writing stories about very flawed people, how do you handle stories about Superman or Wonder Woman who are not flawed and are basically gods? And I love these questions. Again, I highly, highly rate Michael Rosenbaum. I mean, obviously, a lot of you probably know him from playing Lex Luthor in Smallville, but check out his podcast, Inside of You. It's so, so, so good. So Gunn responds to this by saying, and he also initially says, well, I'm not writing Wonder Woman, I'm writing Superman. And he goes on to say, I think that Superman is flawed. I mean, all characters have flaws. It's not as if he's not flawed, but he's not flawed in the same way Peter Quill is. Peter Quill is a mess. Peter Quill isn't as flawed the same way as Rocket Raccoon is flawed. Rocket Raccoon is a real mess. So it's like these are really deeply injured characters, and Superman is different than that. And, I was kind of thinking this is going to be one that people nitpick, saying Superman isn't flawed, and I hope people don't take this quote out of context because, look, no matter what, even though Superman is a nice goofball Boy Scout, seemingly flawless type guy, he is, and it's ironic to say, human. He's not human, he's Kryptonian, but you get my point. Superman still learns things. He is definitely a beacon of hope and an example to look up to in the Justice League, but if he was as one note as being completely flawless, then he would be a very boring character. Kal-El does learn things. Kal-El does have storylines where he develops as Superman, as Clark Kent. For example, even Superman and Lois shows a bit of a flawed Clark/Superman at times, and it's really interesting material to see. So that's what James Gunn means here before anyone says, oh, what does he mean? Like Superman's a flawed character. Again, I think it was a very interesting question from Michael Rosenbaum to ask about how do you handle stories like Superman, like this seemingly beacon and pedestal type guy, seemingly flawless, and Wonder Woman, when you write these stories about like Peter Quill, Rocket Raccoon, these misfits, Peacemaker, the list goes on. But one thing I have utmost faith in is James Gunn is so good at character exploration, so good at putting heart into his stories that I really do feel, again, optimistic here, and I am one of those people gutted about Henry Cavill as well, but I'm looking at the silver lining of what he can apply to a heartfelt Superman story here. And hearing things like this is like, oh man, I can't wait for that material to develop, not only in Superman Legacy, but for the next, this guy is signing on for the next 10 years and possibly beyond. So here we have Michael Rosenbaum asking, you've done big movies. Do you feel the most pressure with Superman? And Gunn says here, I did up until I finished the script. Now it's fun. I love the script and people love the script, and so I feel great about the script. I felt a shitload of pressure at the beginning. People know I was offered Superman years ago. I said no because I didn't know quite how to tackle it. And I think because of that, I kept thinking about it and thinking about it. How could I create a Superman that's true to the character of Superman, that absolutely loves the character Superman, and yet it's a take on Superman that's different enough that it's worth making a big budget movie about it, that it's worth people seeing it, that it won't be boring, all of those things. So now I feel good about it. It's fun. And then I felt a lot of pressure, frankly, finding casting, the roles, and saying, God, it was actually so hard to find Star-Lord, I can't tell you. So I was worried about that, but now we've kind of done a lot of auditions, we're narrowing it down, we're not done yet. Very interesting comments there from James Gunn, because if you didn't know already, we did know this in the public sphere here on this channel, that he was offered Superman a long while ago, years ago, but he kind of turned it down, which, I think says quite a bit, considering when he was working on the script, I think since 2022, August, I think he said it was, for Superman Legacy, before he even came on as head of DC Studios, which is an interesting story in of itself, with the direction of how Henry Cavill was introduced into Black Adam, yet James Gunn was writing a Superman script that wasn't involving Henry Cavill. Like, that's a whole different mess, if you know what I mean. But regardless, he found a good idea there. At least one he had faith in. He's saying that people love the script, so he now feels great about it. He finally came up with that idea that gave him that confidence. One that doesn't feel boring, one that is worth making a big budget movie about. And also, I'm sure what piqued your interest there, and we've got some more comments about this in just a second, he felt pressure finding the roles, and my God, you would. Like, imagine the pressure Gunn is under in general to like land this as a successful first DCU movie, but also it's not only the first DCU movie, it's the recasted Superman movie, of which people weren't too happy about because they wanted Cavill. I don't know, I would buckle, I would melt into Mount Doom if that was me. But he says, now they've done a lot of auditions, we're narrowing it down, but we're not done yet. But he goes on to say, ladies and gentlemen, by the way, like he kind of, escalates this conversation. There's a lot of stories out there about who we're auditioning and all of these screen tests. Then Michael Rosenbaum, interjects and says, it's not true. And he says, well, I'm just saying it's not all true, that's for sure. There's things in there that are completely false, but I can't go out there and say, oh, this isn't true and this isn't true without going through everything. And obviously that just means if he eliminates people and doesn't eliminate everyone, then it kind of singles out, let's just say, David Corrin Sweat, if that makes sense. So he can't really be shooting everything down. He then goes on to say journalists have to do what they have to do. They're trying to get hits. They find out some things from agencies, but here's the problem, is that they find out some things from agencies that might be true. They find out other things from agencies, which are agencies pushing their clients and trying to pump it up, don't you see? So he says, I think my client is testing. So there's a lot of nonsense that comes out of it, and that's difficult because there's people out there that are supposedly testing that aren't, and that must be difficult for them as people. And there's other people that might be testing, and I think it's a private thing between me and them. And what I think he meant, just quickly through the latter there, is, I'm sure some of you have seen it, Rachel Brosnahan, who I personally want for Lois Lane out of these rumored screen testings here, was asked straight up on like some talk show or a news thing, and they kind of framed it like, oh, we've heard you're going to be the new Lois Lane, as if like she'd already got it when she was in the middle of this process. Imagine how kind of uncomfortable that would make you. You would, kind of want to deny it, so she says, take everything with a grain of salt, but then she went on to kind of address it. She was smiley, but imagine trying to get that role and then feeling like, oh, great, thousands of people watching us on TV. It's a very awkward thing. So I completely agree there with when Gunn says, and there's other people that might be testing, and I think that's a private thing between me and them and how it's difficult for people. But then there's other agencies trying to push their clients, giving those little scoops to major trade reporters, and they report it as verified information because they got it from an agency, when some of the test screenings from the actors given by the agency might be true, but there might be one who just wants to put their client's name out there to get their client's name out there. And I 100% believe that. All right, so up next is where things get very interesting in the conversation in the larger space of spectacle movies. And then we're going to go on to superhero fatigue, because this is like a topic I've wanted to cover for a while. I've mentioned it, discussed it at times, but this is something I do wholeheartedly agree with. So this is where we have Michael Rosenbaum say, do you think that there are too many superhero shows and movies? And Gunn's response is much less a problem of too many. And yes, we are not going to overextend ourselves at DC. We're going to be very careful with the product that we put out and making sure that everything is as good as it can possibly be. But I think that what's happened is people have gotten really lazy with their superhero stories, and they've gotten to the place of where, oh, it's a superhero, let's make a movie about it. Oh, let's make a sequel because the first one did pretty well. That they aren't thinking about, why is this story special? What makes this story stand apart from other stories? What is the story at the heart of it all? Why is this character important? What makes this story different that it feels a need for people in theaters to go see or on television? people have gotten a little lazy. And there's a lot of biff, pow, bam stuff happening in movies. And I'm watching third acts of superhero films where I really just don't feel like there's a rhyme or reason to what's happening. I don't care about the characters, you know? And they've gotten too generic. There's this sort of middle of the road type genre / tone that so many superhero movies have, as opposed to having very different genres. I mean, I like very serious superhero movies. I like very comedic superhero movies. I like ones that are really just, you know, a murder mystery with superheroes. I like to see these different types of stories as opposed to seeing the same story told over and over again. I don't know how many times I don't want to go off on anything because obviously I don't want to name specific things. And I do really, really, really agree with that. We've heard him say similar things like this before, but in the new DCU, and sure, I haven't seen proof of this yet. I can only take Gunn at his word for now. But what he's striving to do is to not, and you may disagree with this, fair enough, if you really love Black Adam, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Shazam, Fury of the Gods, all of this stuff, but I do feel, and there are projects, few and far between here, which are like, oh damn, that was pretty damn cool, but I do feel and agree that they have got to this new status quo, and they're not really trying to differentiate themselves as a comic book movie or a spectacle movie, if you know what I mean. And the new DCU is going to explore these, like, let's just say Swamp Thing, is going to be tonally different and independently accurate to that character, just as the comic book of Swamp Thing is not like a Batman comic book. Do you know what I mean? But what would happen if James Gunn didn't want to take this approach is that there would be this very kind of one-dimensional kind of feeling across all of it. Sure, a cool few moments here and there, but it's that typical cog in the wheel type thing. And so I really love hearing this. And he goes on to expand, because this is where Gunn gets into the idea of superhero fatigue. Because a lot of people are kind of labeling it across social media like, oh, superhero movies are starting to die out, you know, so I don't really care about them anymore. But it's funny. I've always said I don't think that exists. It's more like what is happening as a result of this somewhat complacency in this genre. So Gunn says himself, I think that also, people say the superhero fatigue, but I think that you see now it's not a real thing. People are fatigued with repetition. And I don't think it's really just superhero movies. I think you're seeing it happening now. It's spectacle films in general. There's a lot of spectacle films made, and they have just gotten really generic, and they've gotten boring, and they aren't about characters, and there's no emotion to them. There should be emotion in things no matter what. That should always be there, some type of emotion. I'm not saying it can't be really light. I'm not saying it can't be really heavy. I'm saying there should be some sort of emotion. And I do want to like kind of add on to this, because again, some people will just maybe take this out of context and just say, oh, he's saying every single spectacle film out there is just a boring, non-emotional mess, right? Generic. That's not true. It's just like the large majority of what is being churned out as blockbuster films, I'm not saying if you enjoy films like Fast and Furious or Black Adam that you have no taste or they're not entertaining, but in terms of the large majority of movies that are coming out, you have to admit there's not so much substance there, despite the entertainment you as a viewer, as a fan of maybe Fast and Furious or Black Adam or whatever, get out of it. So he kind of just wants to, break the wheel or like reshape and bring his own wheel in and prove that you can make unique films that differentiate this superhero fatigue label, add a lot more substance in there. You care about the characters, there are stakes, make that tone specific to that character. Don't always go with the same bloody formula that builds up this repetition that got us here in the first place in this comic book genre of movies. So I would love to know your thoughts on that. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? I mean, not sound closed-minded here, but I do kind of find it hard to believe how anyone, not anyone, but like, how can you disagree with that to some extent? Because even if you're like on the spectrum of maybe agreeing with this, you must be able to identify that we've got to a place of repetition in these big spectacle movies that aren't necessarily unique to comic book movies. Again, like films like Fast and Furious and other things like that. And again, I hope I'm not pissing off Fast and Furious fans there. I'd like to think that even if you're a fan of Fast and Furious, even I am, like they're entertaining movies, but you can still identify what is being said here. All right, so the last question and answer I'm going to read out for this video that I thought was kind of relevant. Michael Rosenbaum asks, you've worked on Marvel and DC films. How do the two universes differ in terms of tone, style, and approach to storytelling? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities that come with working in each? And Gunn replies, the MCU and now the DCU in film, which really doesn't start. I mean, the first DCU character for sure is Blue Beetle, and the first full DCU movie is Superman. Now that that's happening, it's relatively new. The same thing with Marvel. I mean, even MCU is relatively new. And by the way, what he means there is just in like the larger history of film. Sure, the MCU has been going on for like 10 plus years, but in the grand scheme of things, you can still argue it's maybe relatively new there. So I don't know if there's any innate things about tone, because I think that what both MCU and DCU need to do is have a wider range of tones than they presently do. And he importantly notes it. I think they work to do that, but I think they can do a better job of it, which just highlights more and more what Gunn really wants to strive to do. And he's not denying that the MCU hasn't strived to create different tones in movies, because they have. There's examples of that. But they still, like every comic book film, or like DC as well, needs to do a better job of that. And hopefully that will be done in the future DCU. And he goes on to say, if you look at the MCU, there are very few traditional superheroes. There was never a guy with a secret identity until Spider-Man in the MCU. Their Cap was turned into a soldier, even though he wears a mask. Iron Man outed himself at the end of the first Iron Man because they don't want to deal with the secret identity stuff. So there is a bit more of a fantasy element to DCU, because there are these larger-than-life superheroes. And for me, there's Superman and Clark Kent. They are two different characters, and you have to find a way to deal with them that's as grounded as possible within this world of DC. One of the things I love about DC and excites me about DC is that in a way it's another alternate history. It is Gotham City and Metropolis, Star City and Bludhaven, all of these different places in this other reality. And it makes it a little bit like Westeros in some ways. I love that about it. I love that we get to create true world building in DC. It isn't just we're throwing some superheroes on Earth. So yeah, obviously he was trying to like identify maybe some differences there between DC and Marvel, which I do think at the beginning of what he says there is true. Like they don't deal so much with the secret identity stuff. And compared to Marvel and DC, granted that they do have comic book cities like Wakanda and actually many others, you do get the sense that DC with Gotham, Metropolis, Bludhaven, Central City, this, that, and the other, there is kind of a lot more going on there with places to go. Now, I wouldn't get too, I've already seen people react to this, get too excited when he says after Gotham City, Metropolis, he says Star City and Bludhaven. But you never know. One thing I have said again and again and again, because obviously Star City, Green Arrow, Bludhaven, Nightwing, I do 1000% believe Nightwing is going to have his own project, or it's going to be like a Titans project, maybe announced with the rest of DCU Chapter 1. So one of them could be Green Arrow. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, like seriously. But Titans, whether that's Chapter 1 remaining titles to be announced or Chapter 2, it's going to happen eventually. But yeah, it is interesting. But to not read into it too much, he's literally just listing DC's city names. But he does say it in reference to how he wants to build this bigger DC world with all of these different cities. So you do have to think, we're going to see Star City, we're going to see Bludhaven, we're going to see all of these places. Just like how you see it in Westeros, in Game of Thrones. It's like, you know, you can identify how it's like, oh, it's kind of like my world, but like it's a completely different, map of places from King's Landing to Winterfell. And as he says, I love that we get to create true world building in DC. It's not that we're just throwing some superheroes on Earth. They do have a lot more secret identity stuff going on here. So, I don't have too much more to say about that last one. And that also wraps up everything I wanted to do a deep dive of in this video. So I would love to know what you thought of everything James Gunn said, what commentary I added to it, down in the comments below. I love making videos like this. I love getting into the creatives' heads about this, whether it's, Matt Reeves talking about Batman stuff that we've discussed before, or as we will discuss in the future. But obviously with the DCU that we know quite a bit about, but yet we know so little about at the same time. So I hope this gave you some more insight that you guys appreciated. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I can't wait to read what you guys type down in that comment section. I'll be reading every single comment. I'll be replying to some of them, so definitely leave one. If you also enjoyed this video, guys, just hit the like button. It really does help me out. As always, subscribe for more content just like this. Check out my Flash no spoilers, heavy emphasis on the no spoilers review yesterday, so don't be afraid of getting spoiled about something, because I do get it. Some people label it no spoilers, but yet they still somehow manage to spoil it. But yeah, I'm gonna love you and leave you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you people of the new DCU in the next video. Goodbye.